How do you play that banjo with just a thumb and a forefinger? That isn't unorthodox.
What I can't get, I just skip over.
Same way you find them frets on the pedal.
Yeah, that's the way you do it.
Yeah, see, we do some of them good ones there, don't we? Wow. Did you now for the night? I'm going to do one like you do. Yeah, we'll do another one this time. There we go. Cooling us off with that thing, big old network.
Which one?
CBS.
Let me change it. You know, like dummy? What?
Okay, you gonna do what in now?
I'll do a little bit of that, that's not right key though, listen. I'll do a little bit of Don't Let Your Sweet Love Die. What's the key for that? I don't know. Don't let your sweet love die like flowers in the fall.
Special run, huh?
Yeah.
The show was really affecting a lot of people, and I think Carter was really very important in giving local musicians recognition. It was part of the whole thing that this radio reunion idea is about anyway. It was to kind of break through this kind of tendency that we see for well, certainly country music to be dominated by artists working out of Nashville, and he was bringing on live musicians from the area and letting them play on the show and giving them exposure, and it was a really valuable thing for them, and giving people in the area the chance to hear them on radio. And that's really something which has for the most part died out around the country. It used to be here that you had a number of stations that had their live local country music shows, and that is really something that started to really disappear by the mid-50s, actually, when Nashville really started to come on strong, and people started shifting away from that kind of thing to the type of top 40 or top 100 format that you hear just everywhere.
Well, that's kind of a natural entree into talking about the radio reunion. What was the event set up to commemorate?
Well, the idea behind the old-time country radio reunion was to bring together as many people as we could find who had been involved at some point in their career in live broadcasting of country music in the Upper East Tennessee area, and to really do more than just put on a concert, but also provide a chance for these people to talk about their experiences, and to also educate the public to some extent about some of the developments that had taken place in this part of the country that have been very important to the history of country music as a whole. And the thing which provided the real impetus to do the first of these radio reunions in 1979 was that the town of Jonesboro was having its 200th birthday, and Jimmy Neal Smith, mayor of Jonesboro, who's very much interested in historic preservation and cultural preservation, wanted to have some type of folk festival as part of the bicentennial celebration. And he asked me if I wouldn't work with the town as a consultant to see if we couldn't get some funding from the National Endowment for the Arts Folk Arts Division to put on a festival. And originally I was serving as a consultant, and we drew up a proposal for, I guess, what you'd call a fairly typical type of folk festival. Just simply bringing in, musicians from this general part of the country without any real thought of, focusing on the radio aspect of it. But as it happened, the staff and the advisory board and NEA Folk Arts felt that the radio element, which we had included, we thought we would have one concert that would be, devoted to older radio performers, was really the best aspect of the whole thing, and they encouraged us to turn it into, the kind of event which it became, which involved, a series of concerts, plus these reminiscing sessions where we talked with the performers and asked them to tell us about how they had started on radio stations in the area and some of their memories of the performers that they had worked with and so forth. And that idea really kind of caught on and worked well. And the first year that we did it, we didn't do any actual broadcasting per se. We were recording all of this stuff, the music and the reminiscing, but none of it was actually going out over the air. But there was a fellow named Jim Dampier, who is the advertising manager of Zach's Furniture Warehouse here in the Johnson City area, who was at the show. And Jim is originally from North Florida, and he grew up listening to very similar types of programs as a kid. And he just really felt that this idea was something that was worth promoting. And it was really through him that we got to talking with people at Tri-Cities Broadcasting, WJCW and WQUT-FM, about doing live broadcasts of portions of these shows, and that really opened up something for us, which I think was very valuable. Simply having the access to the radio and not just talking about the old days, but actually recreating what those old barn dance shows were like. And we did that in '80 and also this last May in '81. And the comments that I've gotten from people, in the outlying areas who listen to those shows on the radio have really been very encouraging, in that it makes me feel that what we were doing was really appreciated, and people out there were appreciating the effort that we were going to pay some attention to the musicians of the area and the contribution that this area has made to country music. And I hope it has set some kind of precedent that will maybe encourage, more people to try to break away, from this kind of Nashville-dominated radio format that we see, and give the local musicians more of a break, more of an opportunity to be heard.
Let's back up a little bit and talk some about the history of those shows. Like, what era, for example, were they most popular, and what kind of format did they take, and what was their role really, and how important were they, I guess, in terms of what was going on in radio in this area?
Well, the first radio station in the Upper East Tennessee area was WOPI AM in Bristol, and the station went on the air, I believe it was June 15th, 1929, and it was established by J.A. Wilson, who has quite an interesting story. He was born in 1890 in the Caney Branch community in Greene County, Tennessee, and as a kid got interested in telegraphy, and apparently he took an international correspondence school telegraph course, and by 1907 he had become an assistant telegrapher on the Louisville and Nashville Railroad, and stayed with telegraphy and worked his way up in the Western Union until by 1920 he was the head of the engineering department at the Bristol Western Union office, and he was apparently one of these people who was a really serious experimenter with electronics, and he was building radio sets. He established the first retail radio store in Upper East Tennessee in Bristol in 1923, and by 1925 he was very deep into experimental broadcasting. It took him 4 years to work from an experimental level to opening his station, and he had really what you might call a hard road to hoe during the worst of the Depression, convincing the business people in the area to sponsor his shows. He loved country music, and he had country musicians on the station from the very start. We interviewed Claude Grant, who played with the Geneva Ramblers, which was a very popular string band in this area in the 20s and 30s, and Claude said that as early as 1925, Wilson was doing experimental broadcasts featuring the Geneva Ramblers and other local musicians. He worked out a deal with Sturkey's Furniture in Bristol, where he had an old-time string band contest that was judged by audience response from radio listeners in the area, and people who sent in cards from the greatest distance got prizes from Sturkey's, and it was really pretty neat because what Wilson was really doing there was testing his signal. And in the meantime, he was getting these country musicians out on the air, and it was really quite a while before he was really able to bring his station to the point that he really wanted to. But in 1935, he built what was then a very modern station on State Street in Bristol, and it included an auditorium, and he started a barn dance show there, and that show, the WOPI Jamboree, was the very first of the Saturday night country music barn dance shows in the Tri-Cities. And he had all kinds of people on that show who were later to become very famous. The original Carter family performed on that show. Charlie Bowman, who fiddled with Al Hopkins and his Hillbillies, was an announcer on that station for many years. Tennessee Ernie Ford played that show, and also worked for Mr. Wilson as an announcer. And that's how he got his start. And there are other people who came up here from other parts of Tennessee to play, such as Chet Atkins and Archie Campbell. And in addition to the Saturday night barn dance, they also had an afternoon matinee where anybody who wanted to come in and play and sing could. And a lot of the country musicians in this area got their start. You know, they just had this chance to get up and play, and they did. And it was really public access radio, so to speak, back in the mid 30s. By the late 30s, OPI was joined by a number of other stations, such as WKPT in Kingsport, and WJHL radio in Johnson City. And it was WJHL that put on a show that was probably one of the more important barn dance shows. It was called the Barrel of Fun, and the Barrel of Fun was held on Saturday afternoons in the Bonnie Kate Theater in Elizabethton. And there were bands from North Carolina and East Tennessee and Virginia who came down there and played regularly. And there were some important acts really got their first radio experience on that show. Jim and Jesse McReynolds played on the Barrel of Fun for some time, and many of the performers that we have at the radio reunion worked that show. But it was really something at that time. It really reached its peak, from what I gather, in the mid-40s during World War II, and according to George Simmerly, who is a singer and announcer on the show, from about 1938 through 1950, he said that they had about 1 million listeners in the heart of the mountains who listened to the Barrel of Fun. It was really quite a regional phenomenon, and it kept on into the 50s until, you know, the growth of Nashville and the advent of rockabilly in changing conditions and tastes drove it and most other live radio shows off the air. But shows like that, I guess, really were operating on the model that, in a way, is still being kept up by the Grand Ole Opry. Another thing, though, that they used to have, and I'm sure that, you know, older people who are watching this program will probably remember this quite well, would be the early morning shows and midday shows. And these were aimed mainly at people who were, you know, farmers and country music lovers. And perhaps the most important of those midday shows was one called Farm and Fun Time, and that was broadcast by WCYB-AM in Bristol, and that had quite a signal. It had 10,000 watts and reached out into East Tennessee and eastern Kentucky and southwest Virginia and pretty down into North Carolina as well. And that show began in 1947, and it's one which I think people who are interested in the history of bluegrass have been especially concerned with, because that station, and particularly that show, the Farm and Fun Time show, was the starting place for many of the people who went on to become the great figures in bluegrass music. When Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs left Bill Monroe's band and formed the Foggy Mountain Boys, the first job that they held was playing on the Farm and Fun Time show. Also, Carter and Ralph Stanley played on the Farm and Fun Time show, and there are other people like Mac Wiseman, Leslie Keith, just to mention a few that would be more notable, who also played there. And really, that show probably did as much to promote bluegrass and popularize it in the mountains as any single media force during that early period. And the Farm and Fun Time show did kind of last until the early 60s in a kind of modified form, but died down again as a result of the changes in country music styles and tastes that had occurred. And I think one of the reasons why this radio reunion, was responded to as enthusiastically as it was by performers in the area has to do with, I think, a kind of resurgence of interest and pride. I think that it really has been developing in this area since the early 70s and has been building up. And people felt that it was, in a way, long overdue, for attention to be given to their music and the stations in this area.
Okay. How we do it on tape?
Well, the way in which these shows were set up is that you had an announcer who is also a stage manager, and they would get together with the musicians before the show, and they would script them out in greater or lesser detail depending on the show, really. The Farm and Fun Time show was run very tightly and very professionally, and they would have the bands do singing commercials for their advertisers, and leaders of bands taking part in doing advertising spiels, and they would clock the time very accurately and play the songs and make sure that they were on the schedule. And the performers often didn't get paid for playing these shows. The real benefit of these shows to many of these people was that it one, provided them with exposure and gave them an opportunity to advertise their own personal appearances. And so in many ways it was like a kind of swap, that the performers gave their time in return for getting that advertising space. And most of these shows were done live. Some of them, however, were done on transcription discs, which were 33 1/3 RPM phonograph discs that were 15 minutes on a side. And especially in the middle and late 40s, more of the shows went from being just plain live music to transcription shows. And listening to some of these old discs today is really interesting, because you can hear how tightly structured the shows really were. The band would start up, the announcer would come in and say something like, "It's Farm and Fun Time, and here's Curly King and the Tennessee Hilltoppers," and the band would go with no introduction aside from that right into their first number. They'd go into an ad, they'd do their ad, the announcer would say, "And now here's Curly and the gang to do whatever the name of the song was," and they'd go right to it, and the announcer would come to a break and say, "And now here's where Curly and the gang will be appearing next week," and the disc would stop, and a live announcer who is playing the disc could come on and give the specific time and date and place of the show, and then the disc started back up again. And I think one of the reasons why this kind of format died out was because of the amount of time and energy in the personnel who had to be involved in putting on these shows. It just became a lot simpler to have a playlist and a bunch of records and put these on and run your ad copy. And it's really like a mechanization, catching up with the radio business is a lot of what caused these things to die out. They're just complicated to do and do them well.
Do these generally have a studio audience, or did that vary?
The barn dance shows did have a studio audience. The early morning and lunchtime shows were either done live from the studio, or, as I said, later on they were recorded previously, on transcription discs, and then a band would maybe do a week's worth of 15-minute shows, at a time, in the studio, and then go out and play their dates and do their business otherwise. But I think the real impact of the shows was, in terms of the broadcasting audience that they reached. And it's like I've said, they were really very important vehicles for introducing people to new styles, and particularly in terms of the development of bluegrass music. The radio shows were at least as important as records in the whole kind of stylistic shift that from older string band styles to bluegrass that took place in the 40s and 50s around here.
Now, how did you get interested in this whole field? And in terms of that, since you haven't introduced yourself, why don't you go ahead and do that and talk about where your interest comes from?
Well, my name is Richard Blaustein, and I'm an associate professor of sociology and anthropology at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City, Tennessee. I've been at East Tennessee State since the fall of 1970. I came here from Bloomington, Indiana, where I was taking coursework towards a doctorate in folklore and specializing in folk music. And I'm originally from New York City, and lots of people ask me why somebody from New York would be so interested in Southern mountain music, and I think the real reason for that has to do with Pete Seeger and the New Law City Ramblers and other very influential figures in the whole folk music movement that was taking place in New York and in other northern cities in the late 50s and early 60s. I started getting really interested in mountain music because of concerts that were being put on in New York by people like Mike Seeger and Ralph Rensler, bringing up people like Hobart Smith and Doc Boggs and Doc Watson to New York, and I found the stuff beautiful. I found it fascinating. I developed, a powerful desire to play this kind of music. It really just kind of rung a chord in me, which no other kind of music really did before that. And in addition to wanting to play it, I just became very much interested in its background and its history, and I guess it's really that led me to pursue a career in folklore, and also that's what brought me down to this area. In learning about the history of country music, it became clear to me that this particular part of Tennessee had been very important in the early days, really from the late 20s right through the 50s. In the first real important commercial recordings of country music, such as the debuts of the Carter family and Jimmy Rogers in Bristol, and then of course that whole explosion of bluegrass that was being disseminated out of Bristol on WCYB. All of that was very interesting to me, and I really wanted to be able to come down here and meet some of those people and talk with them and find out more about it. And I think the real source of this old-time country radio reunion came from the fact that when I moved down here, I met people like Tom Slagle and Vestal Jackson and Will Keyes and Ivan Powell, who had played on some of the stations in this area back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and it was really through them and hearing them talk about the old days and meeting some of the people that they had been associated with that really started me thinking, that would be a good thing, to try and bring some of these people together. And that's really how the thing came about, the real source of it.
Well, you also are well, you mentioned you're a musician. I understand that you play regularly then with several of these people. Do you have a band of your own?
Yeah, well, it was about, I'd say 1975 that I started playing on a regular basis with Tom Slagle, who had been on the Barrel of Fun. He brought in his old playing partner, Ivan Powell, who's from Roan Mountain, Tennessee, who's a fine old-time banjo player, and Vestal Jackson, who lives out at Gray, Tennessee, who had also played on that show. And we fished around for a name and finally came up with the Dixie Dewdrops, and that was kind of came out of Tom reminiscing about seeing Uncle Dave Macon, who was called the Dixie Dewdrop, and Tom talked about how he had loved Uncle Dave and the impression that Uncle Dave had made on him, and that's kind of where the name came from. And we played at fiddle contests and various kinds of benefits and cakewalks and things like that. And I think one of the things which really kind of moved us in this direction was that there's a banjo playing comedian named Old Joe Clark, who's originally from Irwin, Tennessee, who's been up at Renfro Valley, Kentucky now, I guess for 30 some odd years, who came back here, I guess it was around 1977, for a homecoming in Irwin, and we were invited to play with him at that time. And while these fellas were on stage at this homecoming day in Irwin, they just started spontaneously talking about their backgrounds and their experience on these local stations, and I think that was another kind of element that led us in this direction.
Okay, we probably need to talk a little bit more specifically about the event too, about just kind of when it came together, and some of the people who were there, and maybe some of the people who helped make it happen. Kind of it's open-ended, but we really haven't talked so much specifically about the event yet.
Well,
So this was when? This was last June?
May.
No.
Well, the event itself was coordinated through the town of Jonesboro's Office of Cultural Affairs, and Kitty Frazier, who is the director of that office, was very centrally involved in making all the numerous types of arrangements and contracts, and we had to write to pay performers and do our publicity and rent equipment and hire sound crew and so forth. And we also had an advisory board, Tom Slagle, who is a member of the Dixie Dewdrops and was very much enthusiastic about the idea, was on that board and gave us many good ideas. Jim Dampier from Zax, who sponsored the broadcast that we did, was also on that board, and Dave Hogan, who's the program director at WJCW, helped us considerably in working out the technical arrangements with the station for the broadcast. Fred Middleton, the director of the Office of University Relations, which is our public affairs office at East Tennessee State, helped us in many ways in getting news releases out, and we also got support from Teresa Estep, who is the director of the First Tennessee Virginia Tourism Bureau, and she helped us get press releases out to Tennessee Tourism Magazine and to Southern Living, and various radio stations received public service announcements from us. Planning this kind of thing is really quite a job, because what the public sees, is what happens on the stage, but for, I would say, a good 6 months up until that date, we were meeting regularly on a week-by-week basis and communicating with each other, on the phone, during the day and evenings to tie up various details. And it's really quite a job to put on an event like that. But I think it's worth it, in terms of the result. I know that it was something that the town felt very positively about. As I've said, Jonesboro has done many things to encourage, appreciation of the historical and cultural heritage of the area, and they were glad to support this kind of thing. And the performers, I think, appreciated it too, because it did give them a chance to meet with people they had worked with, maybe 20, 30, 40 years ago. And as far as the audience was concerned, it was a chance for the older people to, once again, have a chance to see people that they had grown up listening to, and for younger people to get an idea of how the music had grown and developed and changed. We really did have quite a range of performers too, because we had people ranging from Ada and Carrie Powers, who were part of the original Fiddling Powers family, who were the very first Southern Mountain musicians to record as a string band, through people who, like George Simmerly and Dr. Jim Sizemore and Tom Slagle, Vestal Jackson, Ralph Mayo, the Bales Brothers, Reese Shipley, and, oh gosh, I could name more, such as Blind Jack Cassidy and Don Campbell and Rudy Barrett, Whitey and Hogan, through people who have considerably younger, like bands like Hard Times and the Friday Brothers. And we got to see everything from the very oldest of the old-time string band music through country music styles of the 30s and hardcore old-time bluegrass and all the way up to progressive bluegrass and country. And it was a real kind of spectrum of the development of country music. And the fact that this was also being broadcast on commercial radio, I think, was an important thing. Because it was doing something very unusual for this day and time, giving those people and that kind of music an opportunity to be heard in the way that it used to.
Can you remember any specific comments perhaps you heard from the audience or performers about how they felt about having this put on?
Well, I remember this this one comment from one of the younger members of the audience who came up to me and said, "I feel like I'm sitting in the middle of history." And there is a drummer in this Western swing band that was led by Reese Shipley, and he said essentially the same thing. He said, "This is really something else." He said, "You have the whole range here. I mean, all you have to do is sit here and listen to what's going on and look at these people and hear them talk, and you have a real capsule history of the roots of country music and where it's been and where it is now and where it's going, right here in one spot."
And another thing that fascinated me was that we haven't really talked about very much was the announcers and the way that and their important role in terms of weaving it together as a show, holding it together, keeping it on time, and so forth. Not only the musicians that were there, but the announcers.
Mm-hmm.
And I assume these were also like the announcers from the radio shows. People like Curly White, is it?
Yeah, Curly goes way back. He began his radio career, I'd say, about 40 years ago, and he announced on the Barrel of Fun show while that was still going on. And I think there's a real kind of art to what people like Curly do, because you're operating under tremendous pressure. You've got to get those musicians on, you've got to get them off, and of course, back in the old days too, you had to make sure that the sponsors got their fair share too, and the announcer really was kind of like a ringmaster in a circus. And I just had this real sense of kind of the skill that people like Curly have to be able to get up in front of an audience and say things that are intelligent and entertaining and keep the attention of the audience, and meanwhile keep track of all of these elements that have to be kept in balance. It's really quite a job, and I think that people like that, are kind of a disappearing breed. I think what we have in their place is the DJ, who is working with a turntable, maybe working with a tape player that's playing canned ads and stuff like that. And those people deserve credit for what they do, because they're
We want to do for ourselves. All we